Happy Saturday. It's August 10th, 2024, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in London.
And I'm Michael Haney in New York City.
It's been a honeymoon week in American politics as Tim Walz and Kamala Harris held their first rally in Philadelphia. Michael, you and I are Midwesterners. We know this guy. Unless they find a dead body in his basement, he seems like the perfect candidate. But still, these are early days. Meanwhile, in Europe, the UK continues to contend with nationwide riots orchestrated by the far right. These come in the wake of last week's murders of 3 small children at a dance class in Southport. Meanwhile, in France, it's end times for the most magnificent Olympics in memory. And facts are facts, Michael. I'm kind of crushed about this. Without beach volleyball, what do we have to live for? But as always, Morning Meeting and Airmail are here to help.
Well, exactly. And we've had a wonderful show today, packed with fascinating conversations and some wonderful guests. First, we have an eye-opening report in this week's issue from Joanna Berkman, and she will join us to tell us what she learned in her special investigation into Hamas in America, specifically the deep roots that link a web of U.S.-based charities and groups to the October 7th attack on Israel. Then, Kamala Harris announced her choice of a running mate this week, as Ashley noted. But right now, we need to talk about J.D. Vance, and who better to lead that chat than Andy Borowitz? And finally, it's a special day today because the always delightful Bruce Bosley will join us. Bruce, as you know, is the host of our other podcast here on Airmail, Table for Two, and he's here to tell us about his recent sit-down that I personally envy with one of Hollywood's most elegant and handsome men, George Hamilton. So Ashley, where would you like to begin today?
Well, Michael, let's start with J.D. Vance. For satirists, he truly is the gift that keeps on giving, and who better than Andy Borowitz, the creator of the award-winning news satire site, The Borowitz Report, to explain his latest absurdities to us. Welcome, Andy.
Good morning.
So, Andy, for someone in your profession, J.D. Vance is a bit of a gift, no?
Oh, total gift. I mean, I was not writing political satire when Dan Quayle was running for vice president, so I felt like I missed a great moment in my life. But J.D. Vance has totally remedied that. He's made it all better for me.
Did you read Hillbilly Elegy when it came out in 2016?
I didn't. I have this problem where when the publishing apparatus all gloms onto something and says it's great, I flee in the other directions. I think that it was fascinating after Trump won in 2016, liberals in the media did not understand what was going on. So rather than going to the Rust Belt or Appalachia and finding out what people really thought, I love the fact that like NPR and PBS decided, well, we're going to talk to a Yale Law School graduate who claims that he knows. It was like, let's have a translator, an Ivy League translator between us and reality so that we can then digest it in some way. So J.D. Vance was actually really the darling of the liberal media for a while there until he changed his position.
And Andy, in your view, why exactly did he do that? I mean, why do you think he evolved from a never Trumper to the potential vice president of the United States?
Based on what I know of his career, Yale Law School, then Silicon Valley, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, I would have to say it was just naked ambition and opportunism. I mean, all of these guys, whether it's Donald Trump or J.D. Vance, I don't really think they have deeply held political ideology. The comparison is always made and was made by J.D. Vance between Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler. But guys like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump are more like Slobodan Milosevic. Slobodan Milosevic was kind of a hacky Serbian politician who discovered that nationalism was his ticket. He found that every time he started talking about Serbian nationalism, it's like being in a comedy club and you have a joke that hits. He read the room really well. And I think these guys are just supreme opportunists and hypocrites. And in that respect, I think that J.D. Vance is well suited to be Donald Trump's running mate. He doesn't really bring balance to the ticket because he doesn't bring anything different. He's kind of a tribute band, if anything, a karaoke version of Trump. But he is very much aligned in the sense that I don't think that he has a core belief system. I think that he is following what he thinks can be read in the
Andy, much has been said about Trump's Teflon-like quality, and even his mistakes seem to work to his advantage in far too many cases. But Vance has made quite a few significant missteps, even in the past few weeks, going after childless women, for example. Do you think this could be a liability for Trump?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that, again, liberals misread about Trump is we tend to say, oh, Trump is an idiot. He says all these stupid things. And the next thing he says is going to sink him. And what people, I think, lose sight of with Donald Trump is that he's supremely talented. He's very watchable. He's very good on TV. You don't have a hit show on NBC for 14 years without being talented. It's not all Mark Burnett in the editing room creating something. He really is a very, very talented, charismatic, watchable guy. This is where JD Vance falls down. JD Vance is supremely untalented. He's not watchable. He isn't funny. He doesn't have any delivery. He just seems very sweaty and cringy and uncomfortable. So it's not that their content is that different. It's not that JD Vance is saying things that Donald Trump couldn't get away with. Donald Trump probably could say the childless cat lady thing and be fine. I mean, but the fact is his talent and his on-camera ability and his ability to read the room enables him to get away with things that an untalented person like JD Vance can't. And if you look at Vance in these rallies, even if you despise JD Vance, your heart kind of goes out to him because he's so uncomfortable and sweaty. And he does look like he's just a guy at an open mic night at a comedy club who's just failing miserably. And even his friends aren't laughing at his jokes.
Andy, I'm just looking at JD Vance now listening to you. And to me, he reminds me of another character from an NBC show. He would be if Dwight Schrute grew a beard and happened to do some time in Silicon Valley. That would be JD Vance at this point. He's just like, it's Dwight Schrute with a beard and a little bit of Peter Thiel money behind him.
He is like Dwight Schrute. First of all, I think it's kind of a tragedy that we demand our political figures to be funny. I mean, it's a bonus when they are. I mean, I watched Tim Walz last night. And Tim Walz is really funny. I mean, he's really funny, but it's very organic. He doesn't seem to be trying hard. He seems to be like just the teacher who's kind of goofy, and it's very natural. And he's very, very watchable. He's very relaxed and very watchable. And because we live in this post-TV and now post-internet era, we demand, unfortunately, that our political figures also be entertainers. I think that JD Vance he is like Dwight Schrute. He's just such a wannabe. And he's doing material like the Diet Mountain Dew thing, which I just don't know where he's going with that. He seems to be workshopping it in a huge rally and bombing terribly. There's still something awfully pathetic, cringy about seeing a guy bomb on that scale.
Andy, let's go back to Tim Walz for a moment because he's the man of the hour. For someone in your position, is he going to give you a lot to work with? Or do you think he's just so natural and organic, as you say, that he's going to be hard to make fun of?
Tim Walz is going to be interesting. I mean, I think to me, Tim Walz is kind of already doing a bit of a version of himself. I'm not so sure that what we're seeing is like Tim Walz when he's down in downtime. I think we're seeing kind of a performative version of him. So we'll have to see. I mean, to me, the fun of Tim Walz right now is just the contrast between him and Vance. You want those sort of foils in comedy, and you want that kind of conflict. And to me, putting the two of them in any kind of normal real world situation is automatically funny because Tim Walz and JD Vance both trying to change a tire to me is a funny situation because it's just Tim Walz is so over the top in his everymanness. Actually, at this point, it's like, how much more everymanish could one guy get? So I think that may be what we come to enjoy about him. But I always harken back to this great line that the great American political satirist Will Rogers had about 100 years ago, where he said, there's no trick to being a political humorist when you have the whole government working for you. And that has really been the case.
Well, Andy, Michael and I cannot wait to talk to you throughout the rest of the election cycle because something tells me you're going to have a lot to say.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks so much, Andy.
Talk to you again soon. Well, on a much heavier note, Michael, we have Joanna Berkman here. She's just published a very important piece of investigative reporting that reveals the deep roots linking a web of U.S.-based charities and activist groups to those who have architected the October 7th attacks in Israel. Joanna is a writer at large for Airmail who's written some fabulous stories for us, including a profile of Jumi Bello in 2023 that won the Deadline Club Award for Arts Reporting. Welcome, Joanna.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
This was such a fascinating report. So let's start at the beginning. One could argue that the epicenter of American support for Palestine is really located at American universities. And in your report for Airmail, you ask, how did this happen and why? You trace the origins of all this back to a meeting in Philadelphia in 1993. So take us back there.
Sure. What's important to remember, Hamas was founded in the late 1980s. And the sort of biggest moment here that we need to remember is 1993 September, which was the historic moment when Yasser Arafat, chairman of the PLO, the man who was well known, he would always wear a keffiyeh and a military uniform. For those who remember those images, Bill Clinton was president, Yitzhak Rabin was prime minister of Israel, and the historic moment in September 1993 was the signing of the Oslo Accords on the White House lawn. That was the framework that was going to ultimately bring about a Palestinian state, a two-state solution. It was a huge moment for Clinton. It was a huge moment for the Middle East. It was a very optimistic moment. They shook hands on the White House lawn. And what's important to remember is not everyone was as happy as the Clinton White House and much of the Middle East at that time. There was this other group, which was Hamas, which had formed in the late 1980s. They were from the very beginning vehemently opposed to a two-state solution. And just 3 weeks after that moment on the White House lawn, a number of men, approximately 20 senior members of Hamas who were in the United States, gathered for a meeting at a Courtyard by Marriott Airport Hotel outside of Philadelphia. The goal of the meeting was to figure out what they could do to undermine Oslo, because it was anathema to their mission. And unbeknownst to them, the FBI was recording, and they very clearly lay out their vision for the future. And I think when people in the U.S. think about Hamas, if they think about it at all, they think about it as an organization in the West Bank and Gaza primarily, perhaps with ties to Iran and located in Qatar and Turkey. But they do not think of Hamas as having operatives in the United States, nonprofits founded by Hamas members in the United States. And they do not consider that there is, in fact, a whole network that has been operating in the United States of Hamas for decades. And at that meeting, they laid out their vision for the future. And what's so remarkable is so much of that vision has actually become reality. And they were incredibly strategic. They took a long view. And what they essentially said was, we need to get non-Muslims involved in helping us to accomplish our goals. We don't want this to be thought of as an Islamic movement. We don't want to be thought of as radical. This is not to say that they are not radical or they do not conceive of themselves as radical. They lay out this vision of what they want to essentially sell to the American public, and they explicitly talk about universities. The context for that is they say, we need the U.S. government to be less pro-Israel. Well, how are we going to do that? And they say the tragedy of this is that the people who work in the U.S. government come out of these universities. And they specifically say these universities are under Jewish influence, they are pro-Israel, and we need to change that. And what do they say they need to do in order to change that? They say, we need to start bringing in our own speakers. These universities have Middle East study centers. We need to convince them that we're not so radical. They also discuss the fact that maybe they shouldn't really fully share their ideology with the American public. And they basically decide to have two different sets of discourse, one for internal and then one for external. And they literally say, they have a conversation like, what are we going to do if one of us goes on TV and is asked, do you want to revert to the 1948 pre-founding of the State of Israel? Is that your vision for the future? That's a bind for them, because if they say, yes, we want to destroy the State of Israel, that's quite radical, and people may be turned off. And they sort of talk about how to finesse that in public, they will sort of present themselves as one way, while internally amongst themselves, they know exactly what their vision is and what their goal is. They also discuss, we need to start working on this right now, because if we don't, it will never happen. And they specifically say, okay, let's start working on this now. Maybe it'll take 10 years. And what I think we know now in 2024 was that, in fact, it's taken 30 years. What we have seen post-October 7th, the flourishing of this network that was put in place decades ago.
I mean, really, Joanna, it's kind of amazing to see these marketing techniques that were used so effectively here. But as a result, Hamas's presence in the U.S. did become rather organized. Tell us a little bit about some of the organizations that sprung up in the wake of this meeting.
Sure. One of the organizations that was founded just shortly after this meeting is an organization that exists today and has offices throughout cities across America. It's called CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations. That is a group that lobbies Congress. Just as they talked about in the meeting, the idea was to influence the U.S. government. And what's interesting about that, the founders were at the Philadelphia meeting. They take credit. I watched a speech by I believe it was the executive director of CARE, gave in Washington the day that Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, came to D.C. just a couple of weeks ago. He gave a speech in which he took credit and said, our movement of having uncommitted on the ballots in Michigan in the Democratic primary, we got Biden out of, he essentially was saying, our movement is why Biden is off the ticket. Now, I think most people would agree he was being quite hyperbolic and that Biden coming off the ticket had much to do with the first presidential debate. But they are now also taking credit, many of these people and organizations, for Josh Shapiro not being chosen as the vice presidential candidate for Kamala Harris. Now, whether that's true or not, hard to know if you aren't in those meetings, but it will be interesting to see what happens in Chicago at the convention, which is coming up very soon, because they say their next goal is to get an arms embargo for U.S. weapons going from the U.S. to Israel. And it will be interesting to see what happens in Chicago this time, especially when you consider the fact that there have been a number of Hamas-founded organizations in Chicago, and that the Hamas charter, when it was published in 1988, was in fact published in Chicago by an organization called IAP, Islamic Association of Palestine, which was founded in Chicago as well.
So, Joanna, let's talk about some of these Hamas leaders. One of the leaders, Joanna, to come out of this particular moment is a gentleman named Musa Abu Marzouk, who was the head of Hamas's political bureau, and he's still a prominent leader in the movement. But before all of that, he came to the U.S. as a student in the early 80s, right?
Yes. He was born in the Gaza Strip in a refugee camp in the 50s. He came here in the 80s. He was already by then an engineer. He was, I believe, a protege of one of the spiritual leaders and founders of Hamas, a man named Sheikh Yassin. And he came here, got a master's degree, was working on a PhD, and kind of all the while he was going back and forth between the Middle East and here. And he was very involved with the Islamic Association of Palestine, a group that is now defunct, but as I mentioned, was founded in Chicago. And he was also involved with another one of the organizations.
And how was he involved in the Holy Land Foundation? And what is the Holy Land Foundation?
Sure. He was very involved in the Holy Land Foundation. That was an organization founded under a different name in Texas. I believe that was in the 80s. I think it predates the official founding of Hamas. It was the largest Islamic charity in the United States. And basically what happened was after September 11th, 2001, the 9/11 attacks here, almost immediately after that, the U.S. government shut down Holy Land, and the allegations were that it was funding terror and that they had raised over $12 million to fund terror in the Middle East here in the U.S. The case against the 5 top leaders of Holy Land took many years. They were not convicted until 2008. First, there was a mistrial. It was incredibly complex in order to prove that the money raised here was actually funding terror overseas. And 5 men were sentenced. One of them was at the Philadelphia meeting. His name is Schrute Abu Baker. He has been in prison since 2008. He's serving a 65-year sentence, as is another one of his Holy Land colleagues. 2 have already been released. One is set to be released, I believe, in January. And what's significant about Holy Land, many of the people that I talk to look at the prosecution, the ultimately successful prosecution of Holy Land, as a major turning point in the way the Hamas network operates in the United States. The idea being that purely by being focused on fundraising, Hamas was vulnerable to being shut down the way the Holy Land Foundation was. And the idea was to shift, not that they don't still do fundraising here, but to shift more, to focus more of their efforts on the propaganda and the education and the universities, because that would be harder to shut down. And in fact, that's very true. Democracy by nature is a porous thing. And of course, we have freedom of speech as part of democracy. And so it's much more challenging to go after organizations for things other than fundraising and money.
And Joanna, in the wake of October 7th, there has been so much anti-Semitism on college campuses in the U.S. Now that's been getting a lot of congressional attention as well. And we've been hearing a lot about National SJP. Tell us a little bit about who they are, what their influence on campuses is, and why they're under the microscope at the moment.
Sure. The first Students for Justice in Palestine group was actually founded in the early 90s in Berkeley by a man named Hatem Bazian. That was the first group of that sort. And it wasn't until several years later, I believe it was around 2011, around the same time that BDS formalized as a movement and the book about boycott, divestment, and sanctions and framing Israel as if it were akin to South Africa apartheid. The same time that that kind of manual for that came out, National SJP was founded. The movement of founding chapters at college campuses across America began. Today, there are approximately 250 of these chapters, and these chapters at all these different colleges were kind of at the forefront of all the protests that we saw almost immediately post October 7th, as well as the encampments that we saw this past spring. And that's kind of their main student arm of this movement, is through the logistics and the operations of that group. What we are starting to see, just as we did so many years ago with Holy Land, Congress is now starting to investigate, and money is one way to go about getting to the bottom of what has gone on. And so Congress is currently pursuing AMP. It's sort of a whole alphabet soup of these organizations. They are interlinked, AMP and SJP. Congress wants all kinds of financial records, all kinds of information. AMP is resisting doing so. Their lawyer, I believe it's through the Muslim Legal Defense Fund, has said, they're in fact not connected at all. Well, in fact, many of these groups, some of which are now defunct, many of which are still operational, have the same people cycling through them. And in fact, at one of the recent congressional hearings, what one of the experts in terrorism who testified talked about as a possible solution to the way in which this network operates, which is the government shuts down a group. They have shut down more than just Holy Land. The same people found another nonprofit, and you sort of squash one and another springs up. So it's challenging to actually bring about an end to the activities that are going on, or the people doing the activities. And what this expert before Congress said was that she felt that people, the employees of a nonprofit shut down for links to terrorism, should not be ever able to work at another nonprofit again. And that if that were a law in place, that would be quite effective. Also, Congress has gone to Treasury and asked for the SARS, the suspicious activity reports from a whole group of organizations. We don't know publicly yet where that has gone. In addition, it's important to note there was this big civil suit that's been going on for the last more than 20 years. And that, because of that civil lawsuit that was brought by the parents of the first American ever killed by Hamas, it's a Jewish boy who was studying in Israel. He was shot to death by Hamas terrorists while at a bus stop in Jerusalem. His parents, different Hamas-linked organizations in the U.S., to essentially, under the Anti-Terrorism Act, hold them responsible financially for his death. And the case has gone on and morphed through many different judgments in courts, and they got this judgment many years ago of $156 million that they were supposed to be paid for his death. And they've received very de minimis, if any, of the money. And the groups that were given that, one of the groups, for example, it was IAP, the Islamic Association of Palestine. Well, it shut down after the judgment. They said, we can't pay this. We're put out of business. Well, just a few months later, many of the same people from IAP started another organization. And in fact, one of the most recent rulings in the case, as they continue, his parents have continued all these years to pursue, is that, in fact, the court has ruled that those are just mere alter egos of the groups that were given this judgment to pay $156 million. And so the case is continuing. And that case, in fact, what was revealed in that case inspired the Attorney General of Virginia to begin an investigation against the fiscal sponsor of another group called AMP. And he just got a ruling that they're required to turn over all kinds of documents to him. And so you're seeing the government as well as civil, both tracks, running at once and influencing each other. And I think it's going to go over many years.
Well, something tells me this is not the last report that we have had from you on this topic, but that's the most excellent thing. Joanna, thank you. This is an astounding story, an incredible feat of reporting. And I suggest to all of our listeners go back and read the entire thing in full, because the level of detail is very telling, and your piece, you just tell it beautifully. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
What happens when Bruce Bozzi sits down with George Hamilton? Hijinks, revelations, an excellent conversation. And Bruce, one of our editors at large, is here to tell us all about what he learned from his experience with Hamilton, as well as what we can expect on his latest podcast, Table for Two. Welcome, Bruce.
It's good to see you again. Hi.
Good to see you. So George Hamilton. All right. So an icon and a legend in our universe. But for those who are unacquainted, first of all, how old is he at the moment? And why is he so well known?
George Hamilton will be on August 12th, 84 years old. He was born in 1939.
And Michael and I know him best as an actor, one of the most handsome and tan men on the planet. But to what do you attribute all of his success?
Okay, so George Hamilton, I mean, maybe we're like sort of the last generation of people that kind of have a lot of pop like cultural references for him. Obviously known for being tan. He's very elegant. You know, did you know he was been in the studio system since the 1940s? He goes really back in Hollywood. To the conversation we had at lunch was so fascinating because he's really explaining what Hollywood was and how he stayed in the game being not a great actor. He was in a lot of like B movies, and he was in, what was that vampire movie that he did in the 70s?
Love at First Bite.
Love at First Bite. So like really that was like his big moment, like one movie. And he admits to that. So George was, I mean, he's an icon because he's been in the room for so long and his sensibility is fantastic. So, I mean, he's telling stories about, first of all, he was quite the ladies' man. And he's just, I think, one of those cultural old-time Hollywood stars that A, is still alive, B, looks amazing for 80, soon to be 84 years old. And because he was such a ladies' man, he was married to Alana Stewart, who was married to Rod Stewart. So he was part of that whole zeitgeist of like that moment of, I mean, he goes back, he's telling stories about when he was under contract with MGM. He was a leading man. And the actresses, they were all supposed to date, and he dated them all. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, he'd have a date. And so he's talking about this time that just was so specific, and people that were in that were obviously people like Marilyn Monroe or Debbie Reynolds, or you have Cary Grant. If you listen to this podcast, at the very end, Diane Cannon, who's another icon from that time, she calls him on his personal phone, and he picks up, and he answers the phone as Cary Grant. And they proceed to have like a 6-minute conversation. And she's cackling at that very famous laugh that she has. It's so infectious. It was, I think, one of my favorite conversations because it was also just speaking to someone from a different time and learning about, again, so elegant and so funny and self-deprecating and so kind. There's a lot to learn from him.
I agree with you, Bruce. He's one of these guys who, when I was growing up, he just seemed like when you heard the words Hollywood and cocktail party and things going on, like you just assumed George Hamilton was there. Like you'd see him, Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. He's an amazing raconteur, as he's here in this week's episode with you. And he was just one of those men who, when I was growing up, I thought like, this guy, he seems like women always want to listen to him or be seated at a dinner party next to him. What is his secret? Besides having great teeth and tan and being a great dresser, which is, I guess, those are 3 very important things. But he was never a great actor. But he just, to me, he's a testament to like be a great conversationalist and a great party guest. And you can have a pretty good career.
Yeah, no, I think that's what he basically says. He got himself, when he was young, his mother and his brother, they wanted to be movie stars. So they all went out to Hollywood, and George got the part. He was like the best looking of. So look, he came from this sort of like desire in his family. And there's a story he shares that is just, I think, says it all. So, and this is him now as an 80-year-old, but he's been doing this. And he says he goes to like a private airport, Teterboro, Van Nuys, with his bags, with no place to go, with no plane at all, no plane. But he'll eventually see people that he knows going someplace. Like he'll go, "Where are you going?" And they'll be like, "Oh, we're going to London." He's like, "Oh, funny, me too, but I'm waiting on my plane. They're having some trouble getting it in." They'll say, "Well, we have a space. Just come on our airplane." And he hitches a ride to wherever he's going. So to answer that question, I think that's the kind of charisma he has. And it's why people want to sit next to him. And I think it's what's kept him like in the zeitgeist of being like, a famous guy.
Is it a charmed life or is he charming? Or is it both, right? It's clearly both for that guy.
I think it's definitely both. I think it seems like there were a lot of highs and lows in that kind of world, which is not very stable. But I think he was in the room with such people like these movie stars we were talking about. And he added, and because he's just happy, he's a happy guy. So who doesn't want to be around George Hamilton? Because he's going to make you laugh. Always a good addition at the table. It was a very enlightening conversation, especially today, because we live in such a different culture when it comes to the movie business, women, things that he was sharing. George Hamilton would have long been gone from the world, but it was a different time. So it's interesting always for me to listen to somebody who is living during a culture at a time that's true to that time.
Bruce, I need to know, where did you two go to lunch?
So George was in LA. So George also, funnily enough, divides his time naturally in Palm Beach. So that's the same kind of world. Like George can and he'll laugh. He'll be like, I'm in Palm Beach. We lunched at the Tower Bar in hotel in Los Angeles, as I tend to when I'm in LA doing the cast. And he was in town just for a bit because his main residence, I think, is Palm Beach. And he's got the flair for Palm Beach. I mean, he really should be on Palm Royale. If someone's listening who's casting for season 2, he should be on Palm Royale.
Bruce, what was he wearing?
George was wearing a sort of royal blue blazer with, I think it was with white pants, white hair, total full head of white hair, which was against his tan, and a sort of powder blue shirt underneath that with a pocket square. Skin of a 60-year-old, okay? And I don't think done. I mean, they look very natural, and a big smile. Suede loafers. Everything you would think George Hamilton would wear. And again, just the energy was beautiful.
I envy you. I envy you. We all envy you.
Well, join us for lunch anytime you want.
We can join you all of us, listeners, can join the two of you for lunch because it's a fantastic episode. And it's one that, as I say, I envy you in all the good ways. And as you say, if you're not aware of where George Hamilton sits in the firmament, it's a great introduction to a fantastic career and amazing guy.
This is such a great interview. It's so vibrant and alive. You can listen to this on Bruce's excellent podcast. It is available wherever you get your podcasts, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, of course, iHeart, or at airmail.news.
I love it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. Airmail's Arts Intel Report, our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it, is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, an Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
Okay, Michael, it is the weekend. We need some escapism from all of this. What do you have to recommend?
I'm going to recommend something that we have a nice little story about in the issue this week, and I didn't know this for literary types out there, that as of August 12th, it is the 40th anniversary of Jay McInerney's sort of breakthrough book, Bright Lights, Big City. Have you ever read it, Ashley? I'm sure you have.
Michael, who do you think I am?
Okay, I just want to be sure.
Sheesh.
So I love this book. I still remember where I was when my friend Andy Santella pressed it in my hands and he said, everyone's talking about this book. You need to read it. It had just come out. That's telling you how old I am now. But when he gave it to me, I still remember I went home that night and read it all in one night, sitting in my bedroom. And it impressed me in a way, not just because it was sort of like New York City and it made me want to move to New York City in part. And when I got here, I went to the Odeon. I wasn't doing cocaine in the bathrooms, so sorry to disillusion you on that. And it's also just an amazing achievement that I read actually a few years ago, and it still holds up. It's funny, it's trenchant, it's well observed, it's beautifully written, and I'm so glad to see this story by Max Kuttner, where he took Jay McInerney to lunch at the Odeon. So it was a great sort of like coming full circle. But I'd encourage everyone to read it. Bright Lights, Big City on its 40th anniversary. And you, my dear?
Now I'm just craving that French onion soup at the Odeon. Sheesh.
Yeah. I love there's the detail in there that they said, oh, some things have changed in 40 years. That the Odeon now closes at 11 o'clock at night, which, as a detail, is 40 minutes earlier than in Bright Lights, Big City that you're supposed to. It's too early to arrive. arrived. So things have changed, but the book still remains the same.
I'm sorry to keep going back to food, but I do really miss New York restaurants, which has me yearning for Odeon when I used to live 45 feet from the front door. Anyway, we have a good new restaurant in London that we're all really excited about. It's called The Park. It's from friend of Airmail, Jeremy King. Michael, you've got to come back to London and eat at this place. It is Jeremy's love letter to New York of all possible things, which is not the only reason we love it, but it's in the Bayswater neighborhood of London, which is just sort of north of Hyde Park. It's an all-day cafe. Jeremy excels at everything, but he really excels in this format. It's so nice just to be able to pop in, have a cheeseburger, have a schnitzel, have a hot dog even, delicious ice cream. It's all just a really fun, enjoyable experience. It is packed to the gills every single day, so reserve early and come often. But it's been a very exciting development for us this summer and a taste of home for me. So thank you, Jeremy, for making this happen. It's called The Park. Next time you're in London, you've got to go.
Well, next time in London, I got to go with you, and I will go with you because now you've given me and everyone a reason to get to London.
Yeah, get back. Honestly, we're ready for you. Otherwise, Michael, in addition to eating, you're going to laugh at me, but I'm reading The Story of Power by Nancy Pelosi.
What do you think so far?
It's kind of entertaining. I mean, it's not a memoir per se. She's just talking about like 4 distinct periods in her career. And for Nancy Pelosi fans, of which I'm one, highly enjoyable. You know, I read all the celebrity memoirs, Michael.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's very good reason to read how she wields power right now and what she does with it.
One could argue that she's never been wielding it more effectively than this week. You never know.
I would argue that as well.
Well, we wish you all a wonderful, fun weekend full of lots of airmail and other pastimes. Michael, will you please read us out?
Absolutely. Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Al Sanders Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan. And our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. But you can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We will be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting, but in the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music. But most of all, thank you again for joining us.